So let me show you why we did a complete rebuild on the hydraulics for the power steering on our 79 Ford F350. So today I'd like to show you yet another reason why you might want to rebuild a power steering system. Most of the time you do that because it's leaking fluid all over the place. You saw that with the Supra video I did before. This particular one had no leaks, but especially when cold, you haven't let the vehicle warm up, it would not turn. And this is our actual rollback truck, so even unloaded it's weighing in at 8,000 pounds. Of course, loaded much more. I believe we're 27 feet long, so this is unbearable without the power steering. So, power steering pump that was initially on it was mounted nearly horizontal, so it would barely have enough fluid in it. So we replaced that right off the bat with one we had already at the shop, but a used one. It still didn't eliminate all problems, as the hydraulics were very slow to kick in when it was cold, and didn't feel the same turning one direction versus the other, and it tended to, when going down the road, to want to kind of had a little bit of mind of its own. And Fords they need very little input if the hydraulics are working right, so it was a bit of a handful to drive. Once it got warmed up, it was two armfuls to try to turn it around before it got warmed up, because, well, you pretty much had to lean on it to get that wheel to turn, especially with how long and how heavy this truck is. So, and then, tore down the components we took out just to see what the problem was, and the pump was completely, there's a little bit of filter in it, and it was completely clogged. Lots of metal filings in the pump. Even tore down the steering box, especially where it tended to behave different one direction versus the other. Wasn't a lot of surprises in the box itself. I mean, it was worn, but not terribly. It just probably some bad seals in the main control area. So here I'm just tearing down this old steering box. There was no core value for it, and with the way it behaved, I just figured it was bad enough. It was just scrap metal, so I wanted to take a look inside, see if it was pretty obvious what was happening or what and what the wear was. But yeah, so if you looks like I'm being a little abusive to it, it's because I don't care. It's scrap metal. So two-wheel drive Ford trucks in this era would kind of wander anyway. They kind of had a vague feel to them. I remember Grandpa referring to it as just kind of herding the truck down the road. But this one was a little bit different. The hydraulics were actually sticking slightly, so it was more like if you tried counter steering to keep it in its lane, and then you're quickly trying to pull it back and taking some force. So that's actually a big factor of what led to just tearing it all down and rebuilding it. Is that was actually wasn't a comfortable drive. It not quite dangerous, but it made it a handful. Now, at one point, I did have the thought that the power steering fluid was just contaminated enough to be causing some of these issues. And I was partially right, but the funny thing is I had a power steering filter sitting on the shelf for quite a while, and just kind of a little billet thing. I don't remember why I got it or what, but I put it in the return line like you should, and it worked fine until I tried to turn tight, which, because the filter, I held up to the light earlier, I'll pop that back in, it was clogged, so that meant enough restriction. It built up the pressure in the return line, and it actually blew apart that power steering filter. So I suddenly had fluid all over side street in a town. I was picking up a car to bring to the shop. So luckily, the hose was still long enough to reach back to the pump. So connected it back up, borrowed some ATF from the guy who was towing, and yeah, got her back on the road. So another reason to consider just rebuilding an entire power steering system like this, I replaced all the hoses, is just people don't change power steering fluid ever normally. And this is kind of a new vehicle for me, so this made sure everything was cleaned out. There was, well, I had a tiny bit of steel line, probably about 8 inches or so, so I actually just kind of pipe cleaner on it and cleaned that out. But yeah, there's no chance of contaminated fluid at this point. Everything's brand new and should behave well for hopefully a long time. So as you can see, it's going to be much better. Its hydraulics kick in right away because they can actually circulate, and this makes the truck a lot more tolerable and especially usable in winter when, well, it is cold. And really the project overall wasn't that expensive. It's worth the time. Obviously, all those prices do not include, say, shop labor if you're going to have someone rebuild a system like this for you. But that's just what the cost of the parts were, and yeah, it's a good project to get done and get the truck working a little better. And thanks for watching.